I think Taiwan has had the big advantage that many of those open data policies they have were created by outsiders coming into the government. One of the problems is lack of outsiders coming into government departments. So if you make the comparison to, say, colonial days, so people at the moment, some people now look back on colonial days in a very positive way, and I think sometimes they're not very realistic. So what disadvantage does Hong Kong have now compared to the colonial days? I would argue the key thing is having outsiders coming in. But the advantage was during colonial days, if the governor saw a weakness in a government department or bureau, he could go and bring somebody from the UK to come and help change the culture or the process in that department or bureau. Hong Kong generally doesn't have that now. The bureaus are not quite so bad because the ministers come in, sometimes from outside the civil service. So the government at the ministerial level, I don't think is a problem, but at the department level, there is an enormous problem. So government departments in Hong Kong have been very static. They generally have almost never recruited at the senior level from outside the department. So I think if you can make the comparison with Singapore, for example, one of the things Lee Kuan Yew was very specific about was wanting to move people around. So he moved people from academia to the government, to the civil service and back and forth. And so I think that's something which is a weakness in Hong Kong. So the government departments, most of them, although they may be very competent people, there's a lack of new ideas. And so the idea of opening up and giving more access to your data is not a thing that comes naturally to a bureaucrat, because they're worried that the more data they make available, the more that people will ask questions about how they're performing. So there are accountability issues. So again, I think that's not been a strength of the Hong Kong civil service, of being wanting to be held accountable. For example, Hong Kong still doesn't have a data records law or an access to information law. So the Law Reform Commission has been working on this now for several years, but I think until those are in place, there are big questions. And even those, the proposals which the Law Reform Commission released, have certain weaknesses. So we have to think a little bit about, when we talk about public records and access to information, what is covered by that? So is it just the government itself or public body? So it's framed usually in terms of public body. So what is a public body? So if you define a public body just to be arms of government, then you wouldn't know, for example, get data about how the universities operate. You wouldn't get data about how subvented organizations work. So those are things which I think will become an issue of public debate over the next year.
I certainly remember working with you on this open data project at Hong Kong U a couple of years ago, and we were trying to deal with this access to data and access to information law. There are good things that Hong Kong government have and they don't have. So what are the specific policies needed in Hong Kong to implement more open data access and to meet the needs of the public, including private individuals, companies, NGOs, and government users?
Well, I think those two laws will be really important. So I think the government has already committed that if the Law Reform Commission comes back with reasonable proposals, they will put them to LegCo. But I think the crucial question will be, as I said, what is a public body? So I believe, for example, that it's important that people will be able to get access not only to data that the government collects themselves, but also data that they have funded or that they have regulated. So I think regulated means things such as the bus companies. So the bus companies have actually made big steps towards opening up, and now the minibuses, we're going to be able to get access to that. So that's data which is private data, but it's under regulation by the government. So if we look at research data in universities, so now the University Grants Commission is slowly taking steps towards that. So Hong Kong is in the dark ages as regards to access to research data from the universities. So there's no real good reason why that hasn't been implemented, but there has been no push from the legislature or the government in the past, and we have no law that says, unlike in many other countries. So the US, I think, is in some ways the best example of public bodies covering essentially any government-funded organization. That data normally has to be made accessible. Now, there is one slight problem, and that's the issue of personal data. So personal data, in fact, in the US, the personal data regulation is not very good, unlike Europe or Hong Kong. So with personal data, the issue is how to give access to personal data. You simply can't make it just open data in a safe way, because otherwise it infringes on privacy. So then we have to find safe ways. Hong Kong is pretty good if you look at what Census and Statistics has done with the census data. If you got full access to the census data, you might be able to identify many people in Hong Kong in that data set because they have collected so much data.